A panel discussion on Kinder Morgan was held at UVic on May 16, 2018.
My name is Rissel Coy. I'm also known as La Loya. I hail from the territory of the Secwepemc and Statlian peoples of the mainland of British Columbia. It's my delight and honor to serve you today as your moderator. You're here for bearing witness, spilling the facts on Dilbit, that diluted bitumen. We have quite the panel, and I'm really thrilled that each and every one of them was able to confirm and be here with us. So we're going to start off with 4 speakers, and then we're going to have question and answer. We're going to start off with our esteemed Member of Parliament, Elizabeth May, who I'll invite, and then we'll have Stafford Reid, and then we'll Mike Fingers, and Eugene Kung. But just a gentle reminder about Elizabeth May, she is the leader of the Green Party, and she is its first elected Member of Parliament. She represents the Sandwich Gulf Islands in southern Vancouver Island, and in 2005 was made the Officer of the Order of Canada in recognition of her decades of service and leadership in the Canadian environmental movement. For 17 years, she served as Executive Director to the Sierra Club, and as you may or may not know, she has published, authored over 8 books, including her most recent, Who We Are, Reflections on My Life and on Canada. So with that, I invite Elizabeth to start us off.
As the Member of Parliament for Sandwich Gulf Islands, I'm going to get right to my connection to the Kinder Morgan issue, which was that I applied in my capacity as a Member of Parliament for Sandwich Gulf Islands to be an intervener before the National Energy Board in the Kinder Morgan review. I used to practice law, and I used to even appear before the National Energy Board. It used to be a predictable, legitimate regulator. In spring of 2012, Stephen Harper wrecked our environmental laws through an omnibus budget bill called Bill C-38. It's a 400-page piece of legislation that changed 70 different laws. The result was that for the very first time, the National Energy Board was now conducting environmental assessments. So the National Energy Board decided it couldn't allow its normal rules of procedural fairness to apply. It's really important to know that, because that explains how it could be that as a Member of Parliament and an accepted intervener in the Kinder Morgan review before the NEB, which is supposed to be a public hearing before a public tribunal, I wasn't allowed in the room till February 2016. The public wasn't allowed in the public hearings. And as an intervener, when I was allowed in the room, it was to make final argument only. Now, when I made my final argument, I pointed out to the tribunal that I had actually gone through all of Kinder Morgan's evidence. It was 23,000 pages. Most of it was duplicative, repetitive. The purpose of Kinder Morgan's 23,000 pages of evidence was deliberately and intentionally there to deter anyone from trying to read it. We went through all of it. And I discovered some really weird things, like Kinder Morgan paid a lot of attention to some risks and minimized other risks. So it minimized the risk that Dilbit in a tanker could spill. However, it did spend quite a lot of time examining the threat of avian flu being spread by pipeline workers who inadvertently blundered into poultry barns as they were constructing the pipeline. After going through all of it, I finally found the piece I was looking for, which is, since this tonight is on spilling the Dilbit, what does diluted bitumen do in a spill? A one-time only study done over a 10-day period in Gainford, Alberta, in which they took tanks of water, fresh water, stirred in salt, and then said, that's just like Burrard Inlet. Anyway, they poured bitumen mixed with diluent onto the surfaces of these things, and they report that it floated. Basically, that it was that the spill took on a different characteristic and floated in a funny shape, but they were unable to measure it because the ruler they brought was the wrong size. That was the sum total of what Kinder Morgan put before the National Energy Board to say they could clean up Dilbit. Now, since then, there's 2 categories of kinds of research that are going on about cleaning up Dilbit. It was pretty clear to me that bitumen mixed with diluent was not like normal crude, and we all realized that when the Enbridge spill occurred in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Because in the Kalamazoo River was the first time that Dilbit had been spilt in a freshwater environment, so it separated out from the bitumen and went off into the air. And actually, that's how the residents of Kalamazoo, Michigan knew a spill had happened. They started getting sick. The Enbridge control room specialists, with one alarm that rang for 5 minutes and other alarms going off all over the place. So just the way we would at home if we had a piece of toast stuck in the toaster and our fire alarm's going off, they shut off all the alarms. When the next shift came into work in the control room, the first shift didn't tell the night shift. It was after the pipeline had broken that the next shift turned on the taps and put 80,000 gallons of Dilbit into the Kalamazoo River. And that's why the detection system to tell them they had a pipeline break was first residents calling 911, residents calling the fire department, people saying, I feel sick, something's wrong. The diluent evaporated, volatilized, took off elsewhere. The bitumen sank to the bottom of the Kalamazoo River, where it still sits, because the engineering concluded that you can't really clean it up without destroying the river, because you'd have to basically rip up the whole river bottom to get rid of the bitumen that sank there. We have never had a diluted bitumen spill in an ocean environment. That's an important point. This report that now appears on Transport Canada's website claims that in Burnaby in 2007, there was a Dilbit spill that was cleaned up. The backhoe hit a pipeline, and Kinder Morgan has claimed publicly, and now the Government of Canada has claimed publicly, that that was a Dilbit spill. But the investigation by the federal government on that event describes it as crude. So we don't know what Dilbit does in the marine environment, except for this. Department of Fisheries and Oceans at the Centre for Oceanography in Bedford Institute of Oceanography in Nova Scotia, has testing equipment to test spills using actual ocean water. When DFO did their studies using real ocean water, agitated the way ocean water usually is, what they found was that the diluent separated from the bitumen, and the bitumen formed what are described in all the scientific papers as oil balls around sediment. So bits of seaweed, bits of sand, the bitumen formed oil balls around bits of particulates and sank. So we have two different sets of studies that are now being done and published. Natural Resources Canada has been getting a lot of publicity for its duplication of what I described Kinder Morgan doing. Tanks of water in Alberta with salt water added. And they say, some of you may have read it in the Globe and Mail, the researcher who did that for Natural Resources Canada said, it's like a vinaigrette. Vinaigrette, that's the word she used. It floats on the surface. But we do know from studies done by DFO and actual ocean water that it sinks. We also had a thorough literature review by the National Academy of Sciences in the United States and by the Royal Society of Canada, which is our premier scientific body in Canada. Both sets of studies said we don't know enough about Dilbit at the moment to know if it can be cleaned up, because the diluent separates from the bitumen and the bitumen sinks. So that's spilling the facts on Dilbit from me.
One thing I love is you don't waste time. You get to the story and you get some humor in there every time, as well as some good facts. And with that, speaking of good facts, we are calling on Stafford Reid, who has had 44 years of looking at facts as an environmental emergency planner and analyst for both the provincial government and as a consultant. He is an authority on shoreline assessment and cleanup techniques and has prepared technical reports for the Cowichan tribes and living oceans interveners.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure here with the friends of the Eco Reserves, and fellow panel members, and moderator. How I want to approach this matter of this topic here is that I want to acknowledge that, first of all, that before you start this dialogue, is that Canada really does have a very safe shipping industry, a good track record, some pretty good oversight, and it does not want a marine vessel casualty, and spills have been declined. They are deeply passionate about that in the shipping industry, about the role of their economy and safe shipping. But on the other side, I also fully acknowledge the beauty and the richness of our marine environment, as well as its cultural, social, and ecological and economic values that it offers. Again, particularly that to our First Nations. And that is also deeply passionate about that. And so we have these passions here that are now not positive, and that these passions are knocking their heads together. And we're losing a lot of what I call emotional capital in the process. So it's becoming now a very difficult conversation to have. And the fact that we don't acknowledge these deep passions, and before we even start to doing any kind of discussions. And it's very unfortunate that we are so polarized now. And it's even getting worse so now as we go on. One of the ways I approached doing this work for my clients, which was Scouts and Tribes, and also for Living Ocean Society, was I was not an intervener per se with them. I was the technical geek. I wrote the analysis. I wrote 400 pages. I went through the 23,000 pages of stuff with search engines and everything else. And I agree with you, Ms. May. We also, one of the other ways I wanted to say as I approach this subject matter, we're too focused on oil spills. We're not looking at the managing of the marine casualty on oil tanker itself with salvage, rescue tugs, places of refuge. I want to bring that up. That we've got to look a little bit more than just the managing of an oil spill. I also take the precautionary approach as defined in the Oceans Act on erring on the side of caution, and very perturbed in some ways on why that is not put at the very forefront of any conversation, that we have an Oceans Act, an ocean strategist that says that when in doubt, the environment gets the benefit of the doubt. I also feel that probability, when we look at risk, which is a function of probability and risk, when I was looking at this, I want the probability and the consequence of risk to be given equal consideration, and it's not. As soon as probability is considered very low, consequences are talked about, and consequences management of those consequences, even given shorter thrift. I do not subscribe to probability analysis statistics. It's not my specialty. I'm a bit of a cynic. We always talk about the ability to clean up oil, but nobody's ever sat down there and talked about performance measures. Where do you draw the line in the sand in which performance is not going to be good enough or needs to be reached to be acceptable? And this is different from a planning standard that you hear from Western Canada Response Corporation. And why I took on the role with College and Tribes is I got a chance to write down what I thought were proper performance standards. So we're looking at rescue tugs. Rescue tug is when your tug's left, gone out to sea, what do you rescue, how do you rescue it? And we're just talking about that now under the Ocean Protection Plan. And then a performance standards would be the ability to get out there on 93 percentile sea conditions, ability to deal with an Aframax-sized tanker of 125 deadweight ton, and ability to be able to hold its station and tow it. Looking at salvage, something that was never ever talked about. Salvage is all about being able to stabilize the vessel, do a patching of broken hull, patching hulls from leakage, to lightering and removing the equipment product. This is what prevents an oil spill. These two things are preventing. This is managing the casualty before you even have a spill. No performance standards. In the United States, they have a requirement that every ship has to have a salvage provider that meets a performance thing. So I wrote performance measures that says you've got to have a salver on call in 12 hours. You have to have stability analysis in 12 hours. You have to be able to do underwater diving in 48 hours. You have to do lightering in 96 hours. We're not even talking about salvage yet in Canada. We're now potential places of refuge. You've got a tug in tow, it's leaking, you've got to put it somewhere. You've got to make decisions of potential places of refuge. Where do you do it? What's your course of action? Send it out to sea like the Prestige? Or you bring in your place of refuge and mitigate the spread of the oil and actually be able to do repairs. We're just doing that now, and I'm working with Transport Canada and Haida First Nations, and we're doing some awesome work on that. Great collaborative work led by First Nations to come up with, says this is where I'm willing to accept to put a major vessel in my backyard. Not even talked about in the National Energy Board. Another one is delayed in response. This stuff here is condensate. This product has 25 to 30% condensate that has a very rapid evaporation, much more that differentiates it from any other crude oil. I view it first as a hazmat incident first, before it's an oil spill. So I asked the question, Kinder Morgan, what kind of delay are you going to have between flashpoint? Flashpoint is the ability to go woof. Static electricity, poof, gasoline, it goes, well, how much will it burn? Flammability. And toxicity, what's the delay? When you look at the scenarios where they show the most probable case incident of a release in Herald Strait on Reef Point, and the scenario is that they wrap the boom around the tanker. I said, that's not going to happen when you get close and personal to this product, let alone the currents you have to deal with. They didn't answer the questions. Response feasibility. The response organization in Canada do not have to tell you at what times would it be unsafe or not practical to actually respond to spill because of waves, currents, swells, fog, and whatever. And we saw that coming home very quickly at the Nathan E. Stewart incident. That was on 4th Channel. It was no rocket science that 60% of the time during the winter, you're not going to be out there, let alone putting boom around. And there's no requirement in Canada to do a response analysis of where these are. That question was asked to the Trans Mountain, and they came up with a really crude one. And I said, no. And in the United States, it's mandatory. They have a very scientific structural process. This is when you're not going to be able to go out there and respond. So there's times that you can expect, let's say in the winter, on a straight of water fever, 30% of the time there'll be no response. And for my world on response, it's not about ability to send booms out and wait around. My definition of response is called hands-on tools. You're actually recovering oil. You're containing and recovering hands-on tools. So we have no legislative requirement on that. That was missed out in the discussion. Another one is on logistics. The basic model of logistics, if you don't have logistics to be able to move people out on the shores, the booms and equipment, you don't have tactics. End of subject. No logistics, no tactics. Here's the issue here. Where are you going to get your workforce? Prestige was 10,000 people. Exxon was 10,000 people. Heavy Spirit in Korea was a 10,000 ton spill. Over 1.2 million people. How many of you people do want to go out and deal with an oil spill? Put your hands up. My performance measure was, you're going to find 3,000 people to be able to be hands-on tools. Never been done. Never been an analyzed and surveyed. Where are you going to get your people to actually clean the oil? I've been to 20 years of exercise. Never seen one where they say, let's start with oil on the beach and find out where we're going to get people. And then I found I was on the Red Deer River spill. For every 3 people you hire, 2 will you be fired or quit. And these are the ones that got to go home every day. In the planning standards for a response organization, they only have to clean a half a kilometer shoreline a day. That doesn't mean a large number of people. And then we get into fate and behavior. Well, we made it quite clear that there's 3 things that were very important on the performance standards for the Cowichan tribes that I put down was that it shouldn't submerge, sink, or over-emulsify by over 60%. One thing I want to bring home really quickly here is a lot of people talk about sunken oil. You're in a real bad situation if you only have it submerged. That's when it's nutrient buoyant or equal buoyancy of the water. Once that condensate evaporates and starts to just become nutrient buoyant, like equally buoyant to waves, it overwashes. The waves go over top it, it submerges underneath it. That's exactly what happened in the Stucco oil spill. Nobody saw it coming. It landed upon our shores in 1988, December 1988. Nobody saw it coming. When they flew over to find it, they couldn't find it because it overwashed. It was a heavy oil. So just the fact it overwashes is enough to say that stops operation, that stops recovery. We don't have to have it sunk yet. They don't talk about emulsion corrosion. Those are actual pictures of what diluted bitumen looks like. And see that brown stuff? That's emulsification. It turns to butter. Butter is the emulsification. It turns the equivalent of heavy peanut butter or lard. This is what it's capable of doing. The other one is a performance on water recovery. They always talked about picking up fresh oil. Our equipment will handle fresh oil, but when it gets up to over 60% emulsification or 40, it's going to look like lard, picking up lard. Then you say, do you have to heat it? I asked the question, will you have to heat it? Once you've stored it, they didn't answer it. If you have to heat it, everything stops. Then we're going to put the oil into sea slugs, bags twice the length of this room here. Big bladders, fill it up with the product, park it on the shore, and leave it there, and sacrifice $300,000 sea slugs, and say, Parliament's come and take the oil away. That was their solution. This oil, once it gets on shore and it's weathered in 4 or 5 days, the normal way of getting rid of oil and raising any kind of oil on beaches is with ambient water flushing and glues. You just pour water on it, you lift it up, and you catch it at the bottom. In 5 days, 6 days, it won't work. So their solution is they're going to use Corex at 9580 and pour it all over. The company that supplies it, Nalco, was not going to provide the federal government any samples to work with. This is going to be extremely contentious to say that this is not defining the solution to the problem. This is defining the problem, that this stuff gets so heavy and emulsifies and so viscous on the shores that you will have to bring in tanker and, oh no, I use tanker, barges and truckloads of this product and pour it on the beaches to soften it all up. Oily waste transfer, if you have to heat it, things are going to ask them, do you have to heat the oil? Didn't answer. And oily waste disposal, the Wisconsin corporations only have to have temporary storage as part of the planning standards. They only have to have temporary storage on the shore for 48 hours. Then it's up to the province and the local government to figure out what to do with it and how to move it. There has been no oily waste final solution plans in this province for 20, 30 years, none. It will land on shore with no plan, and that completely stops operation. Never brought up in the National Energy Board. Where's your plan, the province? And it was never ever talked about. So what we have here, in a nutshell, when I talk about rescue tugs, places of refuge and salvage, we do not have a marine vessel casualty response regime in Canada. We're just talking about an ocean protection plan in which the taxpayers, the risk receivers, pay for it, not the risk makers. What we do have is a regulated, under the Canada Shipping Act, response organization, and the only show in town here is Western Canada Response Corporation. Our standards written in 1995. And some of the shortcomings is they only have to haze bursts, they don't have to do rescue and rehab. They only have to bring the oil ashore with temporary storage. They don't need to have a final waste disposal. They only have to have a half a kilometer shoreline a day, and that means they don't have to deal with the workforce. That being said, Western Canada Response Corporations, the individuals, they're awesome people. They're great people to work for. They're hard workers and everything else. And Western Canada Response Corporation in Canada, relative to the others in Canada, is 4 times better than the rest of Canada. But there still won't be enough, because the standards are very, very thin. So the quality of the information I have there, and I'll go look at my own slides here, was, well, how good was their quality of the evaluation? Was it highly likely that they would meet these performance standards I wrote? Or marginal likelihood, or no likelihood? When I put down these standards that were based on not being unrealistic, they were all researched, were within the realm of possibility, they weren't just made up, they wouldn't be able to meet any of them. Most of them was no likelihood or marginal likelihood that they would even come close to that. And then I asked them, did their answers come up as being either adequate or partially adequate or not adequate? They kind of ranked, so everything was color-coded. And what we found were the results that were 20 replies were adequate, 30 were partially adequate, and 44 were not adequate. So generally, the more substantive the issues, the lower the quality of the reply. They didn't answer the real important ones. What kind of delay can we expect for the evaporation of this condensate? Are you going to have to heat the oil? Where's your final waste oil disposal plan? You know, like, they didn't answer those. You know. We're sitting down there, as Honorable Elizabeth May said, looking at the well-being of our coast based on what you call meso-level studies of tanks and ponds. Like the one that you brought up, at least one from Heather Dittman, the size of my hot tub at home, you know. And I could blow those science things right out the door like this. When you put oil out in the world and in the real world, it spreads differently. When you start putting in the Fraser River estuary, and you've got the brackish water, you've got the sediments, and then when the estuary water meets the deep marine water, you have this interface that starts to stir things all up. Whole different world. The message they give the National Energy Board was that, oh, we do better than 10 or 15% on oil spills, and they use that as an example. And so there's a case where this Burnley spill in 2000, we got 93%. And you go, wow, that's great. And I go, shit. It was at the end of a pipe on a calm summer days. And their main headquarters was only 2 nautical miles away. But they didn't tell them that. You know? Oh yeah, we get 93%. See how good we are? There's more than one type of bitumen. So when we start talking about it, we've got 4 different types. We've got Dilbits, we've got Synbits, we've got Syncrude, we've got, you know, it goes on and on. What's common is that they were all of them are blended. That's what's common between crude oil that comes from a well or a unconventional oil which comes from shale oil sands. They're all blended. When you put the condensate in, it's blended. It will all weather the same way. It will spread the same way. It will evaporate oxidation. It's all the same. So let's look at some really what we're looking at. It's the weathering rate and magnitude. This is where the big change is. The rate and magnitude of dilbit is so much higher than crude oil when you have 30% of that oil within minutes. That's changing from fresh oil to a weathered oil with that evaporation of that condensate. And it's this magnitude difference that really provides an operational challenge. Most crude oil only has about 6 to 8% volatile, so we're looking at 25 to 30%. The other part is that the industry kept on to talk about it's in a fresh state. You know, they were talking about being an intermediate crude. They were very reluctant to talk about how it changes its categories once that evaporation occurs. That it becomes then very much of a heavy oil. There's the response delay that I brought up. Submerging and sinking. Well, you've got lots of opportunities for places where it's going to submerge and sink, mostly around the Fraser River estuary, which includes the entire, Puget Sound and Gulf Islands, as well as along beaches where there's sediments. Very heavy emulsification. Very short discussion on the emulsification of this oil. As it's removing into condensate, it gets to be a perfect storm for its emulsification. The other one that I made quite clear as a performance measure that they weren't allowed to use heat or an agent to remove stranded oil from shores, and they never asked so they were really reliant on this core exit on 9580. And then finally, only waste disposals, challenge the logistics of getting out to remote locations. So we have these outstanding conditions, and they're still out there. There's the conditions 91. What we have here with this product, as dilbit, is that it's initially a fresh crude oil, but very much more extensive evaporation and volatility, which creates a high likelihood of hazardous materials, an uncomfortable environment to work with. It's a product that will knock your socks off if you have to come up and work with it when it's fresh, more so than any other crude oil. Then it will very, very quickly, within a matter of hours, turn into being a heavy oil spill, much like the Prestige, the Bolton, and the Stucker. Look up any heavy oil spill, and it will emulsify. It will become so viscous that it will challenge our ability to recover it in any effective way, and it will mechanically recover it. And once it's on shore, the only solution we'll have is by adding either core exit for the first 5 to 10 days, or just manual cleanup. So it's the worst of both worlds. And that's my final concluding comment on that.
So many of you are quite familiar with Mike Finger, as he's been serving as the president of the Friends of the Ecological Reserves. He was a professional forester who worked in the Habitat Protection Branch for the BC government. After his government career, he volunteered for the Friends of the Ecological Reserves, and together with Gary Fletcher, participated on behalf of the Friends for Ecological Reserves at the National Energy Board's Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline hearings. The focus was on marine ecosystems and the risk of the 19 ecological reserves and the greater marine ecosystem. So with that, ready to roll? All right, excellent. So help me to welcome Mike.
Oh, thank you. And thank you, Rachel, for stepping up on short notice. We were looking for somebody to sort of shepherd us along here, and thank you very much. We applied, as many others did, to become an intervener. Not everybody was accepted as an intervener, so in many ways we felt lucky to be included. We said we had things to offer because we had marine ecological reserves. We were, along with others, accepted, and there was a terms of reference for the National Energy Board, and we looked over those and decided that we needed to focus on the area that we felt was probably going to be the most fuzzy with regards to jurisdictions and risk, and that was the marine environment. And we all live on southern Vancouver Island, and all the tankers are sloshing back and forth and all the other shipping. So our issues were cumulative effects, potential effects of accidents and malfunctions, and spill contingency planning. We studied a little bit the Exxon Valdez spill. We read the notes from the keynote speaker. It happened in 1990. They had a post-spill conference in 1993, and we were sort of smitten by sentiments that we wished we would have. Since the consequences of being unprepared seem to be greater costs and greater uncertainty about injured resources, their recovery, and the need for restoration, what should we be doing now in order to better be prepared to assess damages resulting from the next oil spill? We thought it was a really reasonable place to start. And then the keynote speaker went on to answer his own question. The answer, it seems clear in retrospect: ongoing monitoring programs, collecting data on intertidal and subtidal zones, annual counts of sea otters, eagles, and all the things they had up there in Prince William Sound, and doing experimental information on oil toxicology on common species. And he said, okay, well, I think we need all of those. Yeah, that sounds reasonable. And then the conclusion was a basic and relatively inexpensive monitoring program carried out over many years might tell us enough so that if another spill occurs, we get better injury information at a lower cost. And in the process, we learned something about the natural ecosystems and resources. Well, that was right up ecological reserves alley. That's why they were created to start with. There were natural benchmarks. There were places universities could study. They were just set aside for science and studies. So we sort of dug in on that. And then we asked the question, well, who pays for the marine monitoring and research? And then we looked at the Kinder Morgan submissions, and I don't think I read 22,000 pages, but I read enough to tease out what we thought was a reasonable promises from Kinder Morgan and tried to push those as much as we could onto the good graces of the National Energy Board, saying they're willing to do this, so make it so. These are the words of Kinder Morgan in their submission to the National Energy Board. The board, National Energy Board, expects applicants to identify burdens associated with the project, to implement measures aimed at reducing the risk and impacts of burdens. We said, yeah, right on. In many cases, the board will make the approval of a project conditional on implementation of measures designed to further mitigate the burdens of the project. Projects should be built in a way that protects the public interest. No arguments for us about the Kinder Morgan, final arguments to the National Energy Board. They admitted that there were costs that they should carry that were in the public interest, and we did too. So we began to recommend to the National Energy Board that to mitigate environmental risk, the risk bringer must be made fiscally responsible for filling knowledge gaps. And the research and monitoring are in the public interest and are legitimate project costs. First sought from the National Energy Board new permit conditions so that if they decided, and right from the get-go, we didn't come out against the project because we thought we would not be the ones to stop this project. It was going to either be a legal challenge or some other thing. If they were going to push it through, here's some stuff they could do. In the end, at the end of the project, when we wrote our final report, we said it shouldn't go ahead based on the hell that we had been through and that other interveners went through. But we didn't start there, but we came to that conclusion. So we sought new permit conditions to ensure long-term stable funding to address the long-term public interest. And all the stuff that Stafford just talked about, the uncertainties, how to clean this stuff up, how to deal with it, those are all the unknowns that I think are in the public interest to get some answers to. If Kinder Morgan didn't pay for it, whatever research and whatever thing is going to be a burden on us, the public, and to do any research and monitoring costs and inform and mitigate risks, or, which is probably the more likely scenario, the status quo continues and nothing happens. Kinder Morgan, to their credit, has put some money into research, and they have put some money to Port of Metro Vancouver. We concluded that their approach to research is flawed because Kinder Morgan decides what research is in their best interest. They set the terms of reference, they set the funding limit, they set the duration, they decide who's worthy of funding, and they also decide on whether the information at the end of the day belongs to them or is public. You will learn later that they consider a lot of their stuff, corporate stuff, proprietary. And we were delighted the National Energy Board on the Enbridge Northern Gateway had already set research and monitoring conditions on that project. We thought, oh, we're in. The size and scope of a marine ecosystem research and monitoring program, well, the Exxon Valdez, 30 years of funding at millions of US dollars annually, and it was all paid for out of the tanker insurance and, a big billion-dollar settlement with whatever. What I call post-spill planning, not the position you want to be in. So This fund has paid for 30 years of monitoring and is probably going to continue for another 20 years. And Prince William Sound is still, the herring are still not surviving in Prince William Sound 30 years later. But they didn't know what was there before, so very hard to say, very hard to say. Further proposed the National Energy Board need to compel Kinder Morgan to support a research program similar in scope. And then we read with delight that Kinder Morgan said they were a rather well-heeled company. Kinder Morgan has resources to meet or exceed any board requirements. That's National Energy Board. They're telling the board, we got dough. Kinder Morgan family of companies has a combined enterprise value of approximately $1.5 billion. Well, that's nice. They say they're the fourth largest pipeline company on North America. And their expectation in the first 20 years, they will see increased netbacks of approximately $73.5 billion over 20 years. Well, I can understand why they want to build it. So they expect to make a pile of money. So, and they're saying, you know, you can throw stuff at us, National Energy Board. We're not afraid of meeting your conditions. So we said, okay, let's go for parity with the Alaskans. Support a program of 10 to 11 million Canadian dollars annually. Let's get an upfront, one-time investment. And we did the math backwards on modest investments. That would be about 450 million Canadian dollars as a condition, upfront. Put it on the table. Let's create an endowment fund for research and monitoring. Let's find out this one-time payment when viewed against stated netbacks. And Kinder Morgan is the highest risk bringer in this scenario. And there's most uncertainty with what they have. And they can certainly be the lead pony, and if they want to get their corporate fellow Western Canada oil producers to help them in a combined investment, they should do that. But just based on what they said, it is a one-time payment, 6/100ths of 1% of the forecasted netbacks. And we saw that as an insurance investment and needed to mitigate marine environmental risk. And we crafted the conditions. I mean, we went down and said, this is what the condition could read like, and here's this, and here's that, and everything. So we did our homework. Kinder Morgan also stated that they had commitments to First Nations stakeholders that was ongoing. They would work with stakeholders and others, and will not end once the regulatory process is complete. Well, like it sounds promising, but to me and to the group that looked at this, it has the same flaws as the Kinder Morgan-led environmental research has. They decide who, when, and to what degree, and to what extent they will share information. Zero transparency. So we suggested a more structured form in this next diagram. And so at the top of the page, the National Energy Board, who had the power to put the conditions in, imposes conditions on Kinder Morgan, and they create this endowment fund, which has a steering committee of First Nations, State of Washington. Kinder Morgan sits on there, NGOs sit on there, DFO and others, BC Environment. Okay, so now we have everybody in the room who should be in the room. Marine Environmental Monitoring Research Program. They would need some staff, they need a strategic plan. Everyone could sit down and say, well, what is the most important thing? How do we, the stuff Stafford talked about, how do we pick this stuff up? What do we do? What's the tolerance of merlets for this? You know, whatever it is, I would trust a good science discussion with DFO and environment and other people. And okay, how are we going to monitor it? What's going to happen when we ruin some of the marine areas? What is going to be the habitat compensation plan? And they have these in the US. If you do something, can you mitigate or can you improve and enhance somewhere else? Shore zone mapping, which needed some improvements. Leaders could not cross-examine the staff, so we were basically in a very powerless position. And we were worried about areas such as this, and this is an example from Race Rocks of what's next to the tanker lanes. And this is Oak Bay Island's ecological reserve, and there's a little tethered tug behind a tanker going by there. So we looked at some of the modeling, and they modeled the spill zone. It's right here, Arcane Reef. Oil mixing in with water is in this area, and it's 95% probable that there will be oil in that area. And some of the modeling was actually, I think, pretty accurate. And that was oil in the water, and this is the oil on the shore. The Victoria waterfront is definitely going to have oil on it. The definition of a worst case scenario is 20% of if one of the 5 holds of an Aframax tanker was holed, then 20% of the entire capacity of the tanker was the definition for worst case. Then we looked at rudder failure, and there was some modeling, and it was done off in Vancouver, and they said if there was a rudder jam and other things, it would take a tanker about 15 minutes to reach shore. That was the assumption that we're all comfortable with these little tugs floating back and forth there. Currently, all shipping exiting Vancouver makes 2 course corrections. We requested information from Transport Canada to change all the shipping lanes in front of them to make them as far offshore as possible. I call this the dog lane. The tankers come around Discovery and Oak Bay Islands Ecological Reserve, and then they have to come in here to F, and then they go back out to G. They go into F to Brochi Legates because the pilots need to go home for dinner. So, and so rather than the tankers going out to sea and the pilot boat coming out to meet them, the tankers have to turn to drop off the pilots. I mean, that's totally reasonable to Transport Canada. So we were a bit incensed that we couldn't really get a hearing. And back to what Stafford said about the Oceans Act, whereas Canada holds that conservation based on an ecosystem approach is of fundamental importance to maintaining biological diversity and productivity in the environment, whereas Canada promotes the wide application of precautionary approach to conservation management and exploitation of marine resources and we're going, how does nearshore shipping lanes meet this intent? And we put that question to Transport Canada. And their answer came back and they were doing the course corrections for the safety of the pilots. And we were at a loss and we couldn't cross-examine a pilot getting on and off a tanker 3 kilometers further offshore. How is that safely any different? So again, no satisfactory answer there. And then there's the spill response plans. There's only one company on the West Coast that actually is endorsed by Government Canada. It is a subsidiary of Kinder Morgan. Now, in the event of a spill, this is of course paid for by the insurance of the tankers. But nevertheless, we found it troublesome that they were playing both sides, and in a minute you'll see why. Because the BC government requested spill response plans from the Western Canada Marine Resource Corporation, but this was denied. We supported the BC government in their request to see spill response information, and we believe that we still need it. And we were very disappointed because the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency was early on in the process denied intervenor status, and they know a pile about this stuff. So we had a whole big body of expertise that was totally blown away. I don't know why National Energy defended spill plans as private information when they were doing a public interest exercise. And here's the reason that Kinder Morgan stated that they couldn't share the plans. Emergency management plans are proprietary and of a sensitive nature, and due to the security concerns are not publicly available, nor will they be made available. So a private subsidiary of Kinder Morgan, a profit center, owns the spill plans, and we, the public, the BC government, must have confidence in this, as did the National Energy Board, because it compelled nothing. The process was looking more than a little biased. People began to leave. Mark Ellison, former president and CEO of BC Hydro, Ontario Hydro, Manitoba Hydro. This is no sludge when it comes to understanding energy. And here's his reason for leaving. Given the board's lack of objectivity, it's not surprising that out of the approximately 2,000 questions not answered by Trans Mountain that the interviewers called on the board to compel answers, only 5% were allowed by the board and 95%. And that absolutely was our experience. Most of our questions were not answered. More withdrawals. Robin Allen, former CEO of ICBC, also withdrew, stating, we're getting the scope that supports Kinder Morgan. It's a private sector. How do you get to yes? Masquerading as a public interest review. FERC considered withdrawing too. We're just a real small potato, and we would have no profile. We would have just been no. But in the end, I think they were right, because we got none of the 12 permit conditions we provided, nor did we get any change or legitimate engagement on changing shipping lanes. And was the National Energy Board interested in the public or the corporate interest? We experienced a very strong bias. All the discussion I see going on in the papers today seems to not understand that the decision made to proceed with this project was based on a process that would not hold up to any serious scrutiny. So I see the dialogue in the paper and I'm just dumbfounded that this somehow is missed. So I'm going to conclude. Kinder Morgan provided insufficient information to interveners. National Energy Board shielded Kinder Morgan from the need to respond. Expected a review of the National Energy Board decision when the federal government promised an overhaul. When the government's changed, there was, oh, we're going to look at the National Energy Board. Maybe we'll be heard. Well, no. They bought the decision from the Harper Conservatives and carried it on to the Liberal government. We were crushed. We really thought we'd get a second chance. BC government has no plan B. We met in October with the new Minister of the Environment. We were pushing some other things. We wanted to share our thoughts from Kinder Morgan, but they're very adamant it's not going ahead, and we thought that it would have been nice to have a plan B. And, we felt we had sections of plan B. We think that the plan B should be transparent, open, structured form with Kinder Morgan, the BC government, First Nations, federal agencies, state of Washington, NGOs, collaborate on research and possibly other things like spill stuff. We still think that that's a better idea than what we see is going on now. And Kinder Morgan needs to put some more coin on the table. They're the risk bringer. And there needs to be coordination of existing shipping. We're flying without a net here on spills. And ecological reserves are an important part, and to more comprehensive research. Thank you, and I'll leave you with a map of the little 19 ecological reserves. When we started, Kinder Morgan thought there were 5 ecological reserves. So we had to tell them there were a few more.
Thank you so very much for making your way over here, Eugene Kung, who is the authorized representative of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation at the National Energy Board's review on the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Project. He works with the Tsleil-Waututh Sacred Trust Initiative and is a staff lawyer with West Coast Environmental Law.
Good evening, and thank you very much for the introduction. I'll start by saying that Tsleil-Waututh, like a lot of First Nations, were put in a nearly impossible situation because of Canadian law. In particular, there's something called the reciprocal duty, that's where the courts have said, hey, if you don't participate in the processes that are put before you, then you can't complain about them later, or you can't say that you didn't have an opportunity to have your say. One of the first hearings that I went to at the Utilities Commission was a motion brought by the Carriers Canyon Tribal Council on an application by the Alcan smelter up near Kitimat. That motion ended up in the Supreme Court of Canada in a case called Carriers Canyon versus Alcan that transformed Canadian regulatory law by requiring regulators to consider Aboriginal consultation and rights and the adequacy of those. One of the most incredible pieces of legislation in Canada, in my opinion, is the part of the National Energy Board Act that allows the National Energy Board, in order to meet its 15-month time limit, to defy the laws of quantum physics and start and stop time and even travel back in time. Tsleil-Waututh entered the process under duress. They had no choice but to participate and decided to participate in good faith and spent a lot of money doing so. After Kinder Morgan had applied in December 2013 and before the hearing order in March of 2014, Tsleil-Waututh Nation wrote to the National Energy Board and said, hey, there's a section under the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act that requires you to cooperate with other jurisdictions. Well, we're a jurisdiction and we are going to do our own assessment, so you should cooperate with us. Started a process of conducting their own independent assessment at the same time as participating in the National Energy Board process. When the original hearing order came in March, Tsleil-Waututh immediately filed an appeal in the Federal Court of Appeal saying, hey, this application is not complete. There are all these other deficiencies in terms of scope and so on. And what the Federal Court of Appeal eventually said was that it's too early to really make that determination. So they rejected it for procedural reasons, basically called prematurity. Throughout the NEB process, there were all kinds of problems. You've heard a lot about, the inability to get any written questions answered. And when we talk about consultation and having a voice and having that perspective at the table, this is not just a symbolic thing. Has pragmatic, real world consequences. If they just had one Indigenous person that they have asked, hey, should we schedule oral hearings in this time? One quick story about that moment. One of the Tsleil-Waututh members, Gabriel George, was there, and he was telling a story, and then at the end of the story, he started singing a song, which is known as the Coast Salish National Anthem. It was a song brought forward by Chief Dan George, who was a Tsleil-Waututh elder and leader. And the power in that moment when the whole room stood up and started singing, but it actually was a really powerful moment of changing the power in the room. This is important to remember. It was an independent assessment parallel to the national energy process because they did not want cooperation. You may have noticed at the start that the title does not say environmental assessment of Trans Mountain, it says assessment of Trans Mountain. There's a good reason for that. First of all, the scope that it looks at is much broader than just ecological impacts. It looks at the impacts of the pipeline on culture, on contemporary and traditional economies, on spirituality, on all these much broader, on health, on well-being and so on, much broader in terms of scope, which is how the NEB in this case and how regulators very regularly deal with inconvenient questions. And in an early conversation with the late Leonard George about the assessment, he shared with me and others that in his view, he didn't think that an environmental assessment was the right language because in his experience, environmental assessments in Canadian law and environmental law was not about protecting the environment, it was what you could do to the environment. As my colleague Anna Johnson says, environmental assessments in Canada are about how do you make a bad thing less bad. It was grounded in Tsleil-Waututh law, first and foremost, and then backed by a series of scientific expert reports, archaeological reports, anthropological reports, and through the lens of Tsleil-Waututh law, which is an unextinguished law, unextinguished by Canadian law, continues to exist, is recognized in theory by Canadian courts, although in practice has not yet happened. Through that lens, they were able to look at all these studies and say, we are withholding our free, prior, and informed consent. We've done our research. We know what the impacts are. You've heard them. A spill is inevitable. We can't clean it up, and the impacts are too serious. They had meaningful conversations and feedback from the community. So when some of the conclusions first came up, there was a community meeting. And so when the assessment was filed with the National Energy Board, the NEB just had no idea what to do with it. It was filed as evidence of Tsleil-Waututh Nation's exercise of governance and jurisdiction on the project, and evidence that free, prior, informed consent was being withheld. They found Kinder Morgan studies more credible. By the time the cabinet approval came around in November of 2016, Tsleil-Waututh was prepared, along with a number of others, to file an appeal to the Federal Court of Appeal. They'd also appealed, filed a judicial review of the National Energy Board's report in May of earlier that year. Those were all consolidated and heard by the Federal Court of Appeal in the fall of last year. And we're waiting for a decision still. And you may have seen a little bit in the media recently some work by an investigative journalist working for the National Observer that uncovered through access to information documents, basically a story that supported what every First Nation said to the Federal Court of Appeal, which was that the consultation process was so flawed and meaningless because it was clear that the government had already made up their mind and they were just there listening and checking the box. But that's exactly what the court in the Northern Gateway case said you couldn't do. And so currently I can tell you that there's a motion before the Federal Court of Appeal to reopen the evidentiary record to include some of these documents in an unredacted form and have them considered by the court. For that reason, I am not as sure when the decision is coming. That's one of the main questions I get. Our best guess was by June of this year. The way that the media is reporting it is frustrating. They seem to often miss the biggest points. For me, the focus on the whole provincial and federal jurisdictional question makes me think that they are living in that pre-1982 constitution where the only constitutional issues were division of powers, and completely ignoring the importance of Aboriginal rights and the consultation regime that's been developed through the courts over the years. And so, at the end of the day, Tsleil-Waututh's primary issues remained the same, that the NEB failed by excluding, marine shipping from the scope of their Canadian Environmental Assessment Review, that the consultation regime was completely flawed, and we remain very confident that the Federal Court of Appeal, or the Supreme Court of Canada, after that, if necessary, will uphold those pieces. In the meantime, of course, the project is falling apart because of Kinder Morgan's greed, essentially, and impatience. And I think ultimately because of their inexperience in actually building any oil pipeline infrastructure in Canada. I think they totally misunderstood the political and legal landscape here. They misled their investors. I think it's totally frightening now that they are playing our federal government like a puppet, and that they're jumping however high the Kinder Morgan asks. That said, I am still very confident that the pipeline will not get built, and that I'll be able to go back to my childhood stomping grounds in Burning Mountain and not get poisoned. So I'll stop there.
I'd like to invite you to thank you. They're all making their way there. So one more time, let's show our appreciation to Honorable Elizabeth Bay, Stanford Reed, Mike Finger, and Eugene Kung for taking the time.
The evening concluded with comments and questions from the audience to the panel members.